We're talking postseason, and if the Mariners take care of business the next 10 games, they will most likely make the playoffs. Now, a reason, Lyle, they might not make the playoffs, their performance in extra innings might be a reason they don't make the playoffs. I mean, their performance in extra innings this season has been atrocious.
So remember how they thrived in extra innings in both 2021 and 2022? You always figured there was going to be some regression with that, but I never thought it would get to this level, because here they sit this season. They are 6-14 in extra inning games this year. 6-14. So not only is their sample size as large as just about anybody's in baseball, but they have not capitalized on it in any way whatsoever.
14 extra innings losses. Just think of it. If you were to even out that record and say, okay, every team is essentially balanced in extra innings with the runner on second, you'll be 10-10 with 20 games. And if the Mariners have 4 extra games for extra innings, you flip 4 outcomes of extra innings towards the Mariners, they have a 2.5 game lead in first place right now.
And you talk about 4 games. If anybody's sitting there thinking to themselves, well, 4 games is kind of a lot. You want me to throw a couple out there for you? How about the Nationals game where they had bases loaded, nobody out, did not score? The Angels, just this past week, bases loaded, nobody out, did not score. How about the Twins game after the Colton Wong home run, which they then coughed up? And then how about that Guardians game all the way back in April that went 12 innings, and they had their chances time after time after time to win that game, and they lost that game too. There's 4 games right there that make all the difference in the world in this season.
And it's not just those opportunities you mentioned. The ultimate crippling factor in this version of extra innings that Major League Baseball has, where there's a runner on second base, if you don't score a run, you're kind of fucked. The Mariners have gone scoreless in extra innings 10 times this season. Being given a runner on second base with nobody out, they're only scoring that guy 50% of the time.
You would think, I mean, the way things were set up when the runner on second rule was implemented, you thought that the first run wouldn't matter all that much. It's not like you want to give it up, but the idea is that first run isn't going to matter all that much, because when you have a guy on second base, nobody out, the probability suggests that he's going to score fairly often. Where it starts to make a difference, usually in extra innings, is if a second run scores in that top half of an inning, because that's where the distance starts to separate the two teams, because that second run is the key run, because obviously the opposing team's going to get a shot with a runner on second base too. Well, that hasn't seemed to matter for the Mariners this year, because what's happened is, for as good and nails as their bullpen's been, yeah, with a guy on second, nobody out, sometimes you're going to give up a runner or a run to score. But what happens when that situation plays itself out is the Mariners will get up to the plate, they need a run, they have a guy on second base with nobody out, and they just won't drive him in. We've seen that happen time after time this year.
I misspoke, actually, because one of those 10 games, they didn't score in multiple extra innings. So it's less than half the time, I would say, like, to put it percentage-wise. And that just shouldn't happen. And we're looking at just margins of making the playoffs, and throughout the course of a long season, you can pick one thing here, one thing there that can change the course of a whole season. And you go back and watch some of these extra inning games the Mariners have played, and it's just kind of sitting there in front of them. There's all this bitching about the roster and the money spent and the performance of guys on the field throughout the course of this enormous 162 game regular season. But we sit here looking at this sample of 20 extra inning games, and how many total innings have they even played in extra innings this year? I think it's like 20. It's around 20 innings they've played in a little over 20 innings they played in extra innings this year. That's the difference right now between them making and missing it. Just those 20 innings. And that's a little annoying.
It's got to be a little bit more than that, right? Because they played 20 extra inning games.
It's probably like 26, 27, 28. Regardless, the number is not that large. And yet, those results right there in those innings change the course of a season. As we see, imagine if the Mariners had a 12-8 record in extra innings right now. the West would be almost won at this point, which is entirely possible.
Again, even if they just win the 4 games I outlined, they're not a slam dunk to win the West at this point, but they have a lead and it would be theirs to lose. They'd be in pretty good shape. I'll tell you what, they won those 4 games. Again, that April Guardians game in Cleveland, the Twins game with the Colton Wong homer, the Nationals game where they stranded the bases loaded with nobody out, and then the Angels game just a week ago where they left the bases loaded with nobody out. You win those 4 games and you are more than sitting comfortable to at least get a wild card spot. Right now, that's not the case. And you know what the root of the issue here is on the offensive side of the ball? I'm about to tee you up for something. They don't hit with 2 strikes in extra innings.
No, they don't. It's remarkable. They have, ready for it, a WRC plus of 4 in extra innings with 2 strikes. 4. So you get these guys to 2 strikes in extra innings, and it's done. You only need to throw essentially 66% of the strikes you need to get yourself out of an inning against the Mariners in extra innings this year. 66%.
How is
and
that?
I'm not even the over. So the league performance is a 46 WRC plus with 2 strikes. 4%.
So on the 100 scale, that's 96% below league average. But on the 2 strike scale, where 46% is the league average, they're 42% below that.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah. It's bad. And here's another thing I thought of. Could it be bad luck? Because, again, we're looking at a sample of like 30 innings right here that could dictate the Mariners' season. No, I don't think so. Because here's how I'll look at luck. 1-run losses. Or your win-loss record in 1-run games. Remember how in the beginning of the season, the Mariners were really struggling in 1-run games? It was a little troubling. People were like, oh, regression is coming. They've been so good in 1-run games the last 2 seasons. It's going to come around on them. They're 23 and 25 in 1-run games. Sounds pretty even to me. So it really comes down to execution then.
Not to mention, we know this team's had its strikeout issues this year, and combine it with the fact that it's happened in crucial situations. It's not the pitching in extra innings. It's not that the relievers are never to blame in an extra innings loss, but more often than not, it has been the bats. This bullpen has been a top 5 group this year. The offense, as good as they've been over the last month and a half or so, we've seen the strikeout issues, and we've seen them have issues late in games.
It's just kind of annoying. Look, the pitching staff goes from a good staff, like it doesn't regret it. It's kind of odd. They don't even regress that much in extra innings. They have a 4.03 ERA, on a rate basis in extra innings. They allow an OPS of about 800, which is a little high, but a lot of that is inflated by the fact that intentional walks are much higher in extra innings because they just want to fill up the base paths and get a force out. The hitting is I think, where the problem mostly is in extra innings. Because they hit 187, they have an 85 WRC plus overall. I mentioned with 2 strikes, it's 4. That's just bad. Now, here's the worst thing. I texted you about this yesterday. Let me bring this up. I think we brought this up before. The run expectancy matrix. Ooh, run expectancy. Because every single inning in extra innings, you have a runner on second and nobody out. That is certain. Every single extra inning you play, that is the case. The run expectancy with a runner on second and nobody out is a little over a run. Like you said earlier, but now this is the number to back it up. A run is expected to be scored in extra innings by both teams, and it's whoever scores that second run that pushes the team over the top. And they've managed to defy the chart. The almighty Fangraphs run expectancy chart, the Mariners flipped 2 birds at and said, you know what? We're not listening to you. We're instead going to go scoreless in 10 of our 20 extra inning games. That's incredible stuff.
We can't stress it enough. You think it's not going to be the difference maker. It will be if they don't make the playoffs. This is what it's going to boil down to. I will say, though, it is a little interesting to look at the extra inning records of the other teams they're fighting with. Because, especially the other teams in the AL West, the Astros, by the way, they're 1-8 in extra innings this year. The Texas Rangers, they're 2-8. I kind of scratched my head at that. I was not expecting to see those numbers.
So maybe it is like, see, it's kind of odd when you bring those numbers up, because then it's like, well, the Rangers are like, okay, well, what if we flipped our extra inning record, say 4 games, and then the Astros flipped their record 4 games as well? I think the thing that's most annoying about the Mariners, though, is 14 extra innings losses in a season is pretty bad. First of all, that's a lot of extra inning games to begin with, let alone 14 times that you've actually lost in extra innings. So those teams at least take care of business in regulation.
Oh, and just from a fan's perspective, the fact we've had to sit through more than a baker's dozen extra inning losses this year, some of which have just been gut-wrenching losses, have been no fun whatsoever to watch.
It's gotten to the point where every time the Mariners are in extra innings, I expect to lose. Like, that's what it is. They go to extra innings against the Dodgers on Saturday night, and I said, game over. Every time, especially after the 8th inning, right? The 8th inning, they have the perfect opportunity in the world to score, put themselves ahead. Don't do it. Oh, by the way, Lyle, would you like to, now, since you were there and Scott already talked about it, tell people why bunting in extra innings ain't it?
Well, Scott explained it pretty well on Sunday. They said, oh, well, why isn't JP bunting? And I loved Scott's answer about, well, first 2 guys got on. If JP were to bunt and Julio comes up, Scott, these are Scott's words, not mine. He goes, what do you think's going to happen with Julio with a free base open at first and 2 guys in scoring position? And Scott goes, because I'll tell you what, I think they just throw him fastballs right down the middle and just attack him, as his sarcastic way of saying, yeah, of course they'd put him on first base. And then he says, and then the guy coming up after him, are they going to face that same lefty on the mound? No, they would go get the right-hander that fares much better against the Mariners right-handers than the aforementioned southpaw. That's why you don't bunt with JP Crawford in extras, not to mention JP's been your clutchest hitter all year. No, you're not taking the bat out of his hands. Please. This podcast, as you know, is an anti-bunting podcast. I don't want to see any player on the Mariners roster bunting ever. I don't care who it is. I don't bunt. Just swing away.
And yet we were just not shocked at all to see that discourse come up on Saturday when it was the 8th inning. It was the like you said, the 2 guys on, JP and Julio coming up after, and then they strike out the side, unfortunately. Yeah. But it can't always work out. You know, JP could have popped out bunting, and then people would have bitched that why did JP bunt?
Oh, that's the other thing. Scott said about bunting, the probability on you successfully dropping down a bunt is about 30%. It's not some slam dunk. It's not some high percentage outcome. It's really not, because guys don't practice bunting. JP Crawford, who's been one of your best hitters, needs to be swinging away. So,
well, why doesn't JP practice bunting? He should. Everyone should know how to bunt.
No, this isn't middle school baseball. Nope, these are professional ball players. Like, I don't know what to tell these fans. They're lost causes. I will say, though, back to the extra innings thing really quick. The Blue Jays, to be fair, have pretty much taken care of business in extras this year. They're 10-8, so they've done what they're supposed to do.
Regardless, the Mariners, if they have any extra inning games here down the stretch, like, they got to do it. They have to. There is no more room for failure in extra innings this season, because it is getting to the point where it could cost them a playoff spot. It absolutely could. And this is them needing to make up for the failures earlier on in the season.